Hello, and welcome to Trusting After Trauma Season 3, Transitioning to Transformation After Narcissistic Abuse. I'm your host, PI Venus Winslow. Our focus this season is on making powerful decisions to create transformational life changes for those who have experienced childhood trauma and narcissistic abuse, so they can reclaim their happiness and personal power. Our speakers specialize in supporting others through their unique expertise and offer valuable insights, tools, and inspiration for viewers to find the courage and motivation to change their lives. I'm so excited to have Daralyse Lyons here with us today. Daralyse Lyons is a journalist, an actor, and an activist. She has written more than 24 full-length books, a handful of short stories, and countless articles, performed in various plays and improv comedy shows. She is a member of the National Association of Black Journalists, NABJ, and a summa cum laude graduate of NYU with a double major in English and religious studies and a minor in history. After writing an award-winning children's book called I'm Mixed about embracing her multi-ethnic heritage, Daralyse found her passion and her purpose educating others about the need to embrace all aspects of themselves. She then went on to create the Demystifying Diversity podcast and to write the book Demystifying Diversity, Embracing Our Shared Humanity. She works tirelessly as a full-time DEI expert and inclusivity strategist. Welcome, Daralyse. I'm so happy you've joined us today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pi, for having me. And I'm really glad to be here with you and with all the viewers.
Yeah. So can you speak about your trauma history?
Oh, gosh, yes. So I want to say that I am in recovery from an eating disorder. And so there were many, many years that I was very traumatically abusive to myself and my own body and my own person. And beyond that, I have a history of sexual abuse when I was a child, verbal and emotional abuse from a former step parent, and sexual abuse within a relationship as a teen and into my 20s. So I certainly have, come from experiences that were hard and painful, and yet I can say today, sitting here with you now, that I would not undo my past if I could, because I believe that it's a huge part of what I have to offer the world and my ability to be empathetic towards others, and it's what I needed in order to find self-love and really freedom. But I had to go through a lot of really, really painful stuff.
Yeah. I'm sure I know a lot. I mean, I can relate to that. And I'm sure a lot of other people, can relate to that, our experiences, when they are very painful, those experiences also help shape our character and make us who we are. So, I mean, not to minimalize what happened, but shifting the perspective towards seeing, the gifts or the lessons that that come from those experiences.
Yeah, and I think, that shift in perspective is not something that can happen too early in the process. I think sometimes when people try to go from grief to gratitude, in a minute, it doesn't work. It's like a spiritual and emotional bypass, and then you're just left feeling horrible, but not knowing why you feel horrible and all that stuff. And so I really, I'm somewhat known in the industry as the transformational storyteller, because I believe that the stories we tell ourselves and others shape the lives that we live. And so, I find there's this gradual process of evolutionary storytelling where when I was in the midst of my pain, in the midst of those traumatic moments, my story about them would have been very, very different. And even, 8 years ago, my story would have been very different, and 2 years ago, and 1 year. And so, it's this constant process. And I think it requires, to get that perspective, really requires for people to kind of like move through those painful experiences and continue to do what it takes, right, to evolve past that and to kind of like not let your story, your present story, your future story be defined by your past experiences, but also to know that those past experiences are very important. And unless they're dealt with and reconciled in some way, I think, we will spend our lifetimes sort of repeating patterns of trauma, feeling stuck in certain ways, feeling ashamed, like it's shrinking from the world. And so, yeah, it's this weird dance and symbiosis, I think, between the past and the present, and wanting to move forward, and also knowing that, like, we can't, what happened happened, and it continues to inform many things, right? And so, like, yeah, it's important to honor it and honor ourselves while also trying our best not to stay stuck.
Yeah. Yeah. So, how has DEI work supported your healing?
Yeah, well, that's such a great question. So I want to first define what DEI is. It stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, what does that mean, right? So diversity is sort of all of the things that make us who we are, all of these intersecting factors of identity and experience. I think this world is a very diverse place. There's people who look like me, people who don't look like me, people who have similar life histories, people who don't. So diversity, being exposed to people from all different stratospheres of society, has given me a deeper sense of human resilience and an understanding of my own experiences through the experiences of other human beings that I've sat with as a journalist and a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert, and really gotten to see, like, oh, well, what brings us together as humans? What is that? What is it? What is that spark? What is that spirit? What is that light, right? That animates us. And if that light is in you, well, then it also must be in me. And so the diversity piece has a lot to do with that. Equity, which is really about supporting people at the level that they are and equipping them for success, and understanding that people have different needs and different requirements, and really trying to, like, honor where someone is. I think that's very, very helpful for trauma work, actually. Like, right? Like, it's discovering, well, where is someone and what kind of scaffolding do you require in order to live the life that you want, and meet your goals and metrics, and sort of be a member of society in a way that feels good to you and self-honoring, and also where you're of contribution. And so, that equity work, I think, is incredibly important to trauma work. And then inclusion, I mean, like, one of the worst things about trauma, for me, I mean, I can't speak to anyone else's experience, but for me, one of the worst things was feeling lack of safety, and feeling like there were parts of me that I could not share with others. There were parts of me that I could not, that like had to be hidden, right? And feeling a sense of aloneness. And I think that's something that a lot of people with trauma histories feel, like, I'm the only one, and that sense of shame. And so inclusion, inclusion is essential, in a sense of belonging, and a sense of community, and people that you can be yourself with and share your story, that know the things about you that you think are unlovable, know the things about me that I think are unlovable, and those people love me and they honor me. There's so much healing in that. So I think diversity, equity, and inclusion is really part of the experience of, like, engaging with the world in a meaningful way, in a way that allows me to be all of myself, and create space for others to be all of themselves. I think it's incredibly healing, and I wish more people looked at DEI that way, because I think if more people did, more would get on board with, with that sort of active engagement and that deep curiosity about themselves and others.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So, like, playing off of that, like, how does it support other people?
Yeah, that is such a great question. So how does diversity work support other people specifically? So one of the things that I was finding, one of the creators of the Demystifying Diversity podcast, and we had a lot of people write in the midst of season one, and a lot of people said things like, thank you for sharing parts of my story, right? Like, and these were not people that I interviewed. These are not people that were like on the record, but they were people that were seeing themselves reflected in the experiences of others. So, for example, we dealt with the spectrum of gender identity and human sexuality. We dealt with racial sort of, the space between the binaries and biracial identity, which is I'm biracial. We talked about body liberation and fat acceptance and, shaming of different body types. We talked about a lot of different things, but those are ones that come to mind when I'm thinking about people who reached out specifically and said, thank you so much for talking about this, because I wasn't hearing my story reflected, and it was so important. And so that, it allowed people to engage, I think, and to see themselves reflected in certain ways. Also, many of the people I interviewed, 128 people for season one of the podcast, which was such a gift. And it also informed the writing of the book. And every single person that I spoke with said, thank you so much. And many of those people do tell their stories at high levels. Many of them have occupied stages and spoken openly about their experiences. And those were beautiful, enriching stories and experiences. But some of the interviews that most stand out to me are the ones of people who said, nobody had ever asked me, to tell my story before. No one ever wanted to hear. I didn't think I could talk about this. I didn't think anyone would want to listen. And that, to me, just this acknowledgement of how much people crave being heard, being listened to, and listened to in a way, as a journalist, and Pi, you're doing this right now, right? Like, you're asking questions, but it's really about my experience, my story, me sharing openly with you. It's not, like call and response, which I think is how so much of conversation is. It's like one person says something and the other person's already premeditating what they're supposed to be saying. And so just to be heard, I really, that's one of the things that I think diversity, equity, and inclusion has given me, is an appreciation for how much people crave being known and heard and loved as they are, and crave a sense of belonging. And I think those are the same things that people crave when they're coming out of trauma, coming out of abusive relationships, coming out of, childhood experiences where they were told it's not okay to be you. And like, we're all craving that feeling of like, oh yeah, I can be me, and not just me as an individual, but me in community with others, in a way where I make contributions to them, they make contributions to me, and we can move forward as a collective.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's so beautiful. It's so like win-win,
Yeah.
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 Yeah. So beautiful. Well, let's talk about binaries. Why are binaries toxic?
Yeah. Oh, so in and of themselves, binaries, there's nothing wrong with that. But the challenge is when the binaries are the only thing that's offered, and there's a belief that people have to fit into these binary categories and there's nothing in between.
Mm,
So I'll give two concrete examples. So one is, I mentioned that I'm biracial. My dad was Black, my mom is white. And so, I exist in that spectrum between these, what in, at least in American society, are considered these binary races, right? White and Black. Well, if I exist in that space between, right? Like, it is dishonoring to me personally, to my lived experience, to how I self-identify, if I were forced to kind of pick a category, right? To pick a side. And so, but often people are placed in that position where they're made to say like, well, no, you can't be two things at once. So what are you really? Like, who are you really? And same thing with gender, we're seeing that, right? That there's often it's set up as, okay, well, you're either male or female. And really what we know is that there are a lot of people who identify somewhere in the spectrum between those extremes. Same thing with, human sexuality, right? Like, there's something between yeah, like between these binary categories of like either entirely same-sex attraction or entirely different gender orientation, right? Like there's something in that in between space. And I think that the more we create room for people to be authentically wherever they are, whether that's in the binaries or somewhere in the spectrum between them, I think the more healing it is for our sense of who we are, and the less it makes people feel like, oh, but I don't fit, right? Because like that's a huge thing that like we struggle with, wanting to belong. And so if you're told that, okay, well, either you can belong in this box or this box, and a person doesn't really see themselves completely in either, well, that can be very psychologically damaging, to try to either force yourself to fit in or to feel like, okay, well, I'm not going to fit in. But then by virtue of not fitting in and being like going counter to culture, then somehow I feel like I'm ostracized or like I don't fit, and a lot of, I think when they're talking about the mental health impacts of racism and mental health impacts of being a member of certain marginalized communities or communities, members of the LGBTQ community, which I am also a member of that. I'm bisexual. Many members of the LGBTQ community who have experienced trauma of being discriminated against. Like there are a lot of really negative psychological and social ramifications and internal consequences and cultural consequences. So when I talk about the binaries being toxic, it's more like having binaries as the only option is really toxic. So I'm not trying to negate those as choices or not even choices, but as markers of identity. But I think for some people they are being forced to choose one or the other, and their answer is neither or all or some combination, right? And so it's about honoring people's experience and letting them tell you who they are, as opposed to you telling them who you think they
Yeah. Yeah, that's so powerful. And I think it makes sense to kind of flip that around on yourself, like accepting that like you internally don't fit exactly over here or over here, like accepting who you are in the middle and not letting other people tell you what box you need to put yourself into, more of like a way to have self-acceptance and then also to like give that to other people.
are. I'll give a somewhat, not an identity example from my own experience, but an experience example that I think deeply relates to trauma and this idea that, oh, it's either one thing or the other. And I've spoken about this before publicly, but not often. So I'm so glad to be able to kind of talk about it in this space, because I think it could be helpful to your audience. So I was sexually abused when I was 5, and I was sexually abused by a friend of the family who was like a father figure to me, who was deeply beloved to me, and I cherished him in many, many ways. And also, I experienced sexual abuse, right? And so many well-meaning people in my life, as I got older and began to be more open about what happened, said, isn't he a horrible person? I can't believe he did that to you. You must hate him, right? And like I was told, okay, well, you're supposed to hate him. And my experience was actually that like I deeply, deeply loved this person and I hated what was done to me. And some of it was painful, but it was also kind of pleasurable. And like it was really hard to reconcile all of that. And for me, a tremendous healing happened when I said, you know what, I loved this person and they did this thing that was really damaging to me. And and it was hard that they did that. And I don't like that I still have consequences of that. But it also didn't mean that I stopped loving them the moment that that happened, or that we didn't have good experiences together before or after. And so much of my shame and my internal confusion was sort of dissipated the moment that I said, you know what, I can hold multiple things at the same time. And I have found, because I do some consulting work with people and some coaching, and I have found that often when someone has been the victim of some sort of abuse or has survived some level of trauma, especially if it's from someone that you love or have a complicated relationship with, being able to kind of hold numerous feelings and even seemingly conflicting feelings at the same time is an essential part of that healing process. And so that's an example of how, like, it's not always identity. Sometimes it's emotions, sometimes it's experiences, sometimes it's but yeah, like that, this need to kind of choose between things, I think really can be very, very harmful.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. While you were telling that story, I was thinking, well, yeah, I mean, like I had a narcissistic mother and it's like, she's my mother. It's like there's still like there's so many conflicting feelings there, right? When you experience abuse from someone you love.
Yeah, and even sometimes like the person can love you, but they can do a horrible thing. And it's like, well, what does that mean? Does it mean they didn't love me? And all these, I think the human brain tries to figure things out and put it in boxes and categorize and sort. And the more I do the work that I do, and the more I love myself and other people, the more I realize the complexity of human identity and the complexity of human experience, and that like good people do bad things, bad people do good things. Most of us are kind of a mixed bag of just like our own baggage and our own wants and desires, and we're pulled and we're pushed, and life gets really messy. And I think if for me, holding that messiness has been just like such a gift, because it allows me to love my imperfect self, and it allows me to show up vulnerably and to be honest about what's happening with me. And that's huge too in trauma recovery, and being able to say like, yeah, this is what I'm feeling today, and not eat that or stuff it, or I don't know, drink the pain away, or what, all the things that people do in order to kind of make themselves okay with the fact that they're not okay, as opposed to just being able to say, I'm not okay right now, and share that with someone, and have some of that begin to dissipate in the process of being loved in a way that is actually nurturing. And I also want to just say, when I talk about sharing with someone, like find someone safe, to share with, right? Because that can be damaging to share with an unsafe person. But like even just sharing with yourself, even just beginning with journaling, or sort of conscious breathing or something, right? Like a form of kind of coming home to you, and then finding someone in your sphere, or a paid professional or a coach or mentor, or someone that is trustworthy, that you can just say, you know what, can you just listen to me? Like, can I just not be fixed, not be whatever, but can I just share authentically of myself with you?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Can you tell us like what is othering people, and why is it dangerous?
Yeah. Ooh, okay. So othering is a concept, it's a word that means like, I'm trying to think of how to kind of like frame it in a way that's understandable. But so it basically holds that like I am one thing, I am one identity, and you are other, you are different than I am, right? And so it can happen around race, it can happen around gender, it can happen around disabilities, it can happen around a lot of sort of the isms of society. So ableism, racism, xenophobia, the things that where basically it's like, well, this identity is somehow praised or lauded, and this identity is less than or fundamentally different from. And so so it begins with that paradigm, right? When someone has that thought process, and then the othering itself is sort of like calling out that person's differences, or pointing out the ways in which this sort of imaginary ladder of worth and societal ranking, right? Like, well, I am better because I am this way, and you are different because you are that way. And so othering, I mean, I think othering in and of itself is a very traumatizing thing to be on the receiving end of, because it feels like, oh my gosh, you're telling me that I'm not as good. And that can be in a very aggressive and overt way, and even a violent way, or it can be in a very kind of microaggressive way where it's like, did that person just say, did they just mean that, And I want to say as well that othering, most people point out that othering is very damaging to the person who is being othered, to the person who is being discriminated against. And it is. It is hugely problematic and painful and sad. And at the same time, the person doing the othering is also hurting themselves by doing that.
Yeah.
Because there is this lack of acknowledgement of the shared nature of humanity, of empathy, of depth. And in fact, there's a huge level of sort of false perfectionism and idolatry that goes into that is very alienating. And when we look at things like, the opioid crisis in America and the high rates of suicide, especially by gun, and just different things where people are deeply traumatized, who are doing the traumatizing of other people. And so I think that's an important point of reflection, is that no one emerges from this stuff unscathed, right? So like, if you're thinking that it's going to make you feel better, or I'm thinking that it's going to make me feel superior to point out how I'm better than someone else, well, actually, no, the reverse is true. And so if I am pointing out what is different or wrong about you, like, really, it's essential for me to do the work to not see the world that way, because it's healing to me. It's restorative to me to be able to see whoever is in front of me as a fellow human being, to be able to kind of like see their soul, their goodness, their resilience, their culture, their whatever, the things that make them them, and honor that and appreciate that, and ask myself, like, what can I learn from this? How can I engage with this person? How can I be curious about them? How can I see myself reflected in them? Like, all of these things are things that bring the person doing that engaging a high level of healing, and also are healing to the person who has maybe felt othered or excluded and is now being invited in to the space, being invited into the conversation. Like, I believe that we're all connected, and that we all are, engaged in this symbiotic experience of life. And so if I'm hurting someone else, or separating myself from someone else in a way that is cruel or violent or harsh, I'm hurting myself, I'm hurting them, I'm hurting, like, there's just nobody win. You talked earlier about win-win, and I think othering is a lose-lose, right? Everybody.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Daralyse, can you speak about humanization versus dehumanization?
Yeah, absolutely. So dehumanization, I'll start with that first, would be essentially failing to recognize the humanity of another segment of the population, or, and I think this tends to center around issues of demographics, so like race, gender, religion, those kinds of identity markers that people will dehumanize other groups of people or other individuals. And what it looks like is what's happening, sadly, in America right now, with police brutality against people of color. It's happening with, Islamophobia against Muslim Americans. It's happening with the the rampant anti-Semitism that's happening on college campuses, with the violence against Asians in America. It's prevalent. Like, we're seeing, slavery was an extreme example of dehumanization from one subset of society against another, based purely on skin color, and these imaginary sort of codifications of who ranks and who does not. And it was brutal, and is brutal, and the lingering impacts of that are just seen, on a daily basis in America and elsewhere. I can mostly speak to the experience in this country because that's where I was born and raised, and that tends to be most of the people that I interview. But I interviewed someone earlier today who was speaking about his experiences of apartheid in Africa, right? And so yeah, dehumanization is devastating, and it has serious consequences, and we miss out on the beauty of other people when, when people dehumanize, and it makes victims of some people, and it makes victimizers of others, and again, for all the reasons that we talked about earlier, it's equally dehumanizing actually to the person who is doing the dehumanizing. I mean, the pain suffered might be different, and the level of agency might be different, but it is excruciating. The oppressor is dehumanizing themselves even as they're dehumanizing someone else. And so that's what dehumanization looks like. That's sort of how to conceptualize it. And humanization is the exact opposite of that, right? So it's this recognition that I am a person, you are a person, we each have value. Every person in that comprises the various social collectives of which we are a part has value, has something to offer, has a beauty and a dynamism and a soul and a spirit that is uniquely their own, and yet also not fundamentally different from mine or yours or the next person. And so humanization is really about that. It's about seeing the value in each and every fellow human being, respecting their agency and autonomy and decision making, respecting that they know themselves, wanting to engage, wanting to learn more about our fellow people, appreciating the resilience of human beings, and having empathy. I mean, I think empathy is the way to humanization, is when we can really, look at someone else and say, tell me who you are, tell me about yourself. And I think that's something that we can turn that skill in on ourselves. And I mean, many of the members of your viewing audience may have done some mirror work or something, but like looking at yourself in your own eyes, or writing in a journal, or however we engage, right? And going to therapy, all of the things, just a way to kind of like look at ourselves and say, okay, I might not feel good enough. I might not feel smart enough. I might not feel pretty enough. I might not feel, I might feel so damaged based on my past, but I'm going to acknowledge that I have some value and worth, and I'm going to spend the time seeing that value and worth and honoring it and getting to know myself better. I mean, I think it's something we can do with us, and we can do with others. And it's sort of it sort of feeds on itself, right? Like the more that I acknowledge the beauty of other human beings, the more I'm forced to recognize my own beauty as well. And the more I acknowledge my own beauty and goodness and let go of some of the barriers that are keeping me stuck, the more I kind of have an open heart space to be able to connect with others. So I think it's a mix of doing this work on ourselves and also being engaged in the world in a way where we can see the humanity in other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. That was so beautiful. Mm. And you have a free gift for our viewers. Would you tell us about that?
Yeah, I do. So I wrote a book called Demystifying Diversity, Embracing Our Shared Humanity. And the book is based on the 128 interviews that I conducted over the span of about a year, and takeaways from that, some learnings about like how to stand up for ourselves and others, how to embrace who we are at a core level, how to make a commitment to engaging in meaningful ways with people and from cultures or backgrounds that are different than our own, and really just like kind of falling in love with ourselves and others. And so there's a book and a workbook that you can buy separately. And so yeah, what I did as the free giveaway is gave people the preface and the first chapter, along with the workbook preface and the first workbook chapter, so that they can just begin to engage. It's totally free, no obligation to buy the book. But I think there's some beautiful lessons about healing and moving through the pain of the past and finding a sense of belonging and finding a sense of purpose, and just like learning to love, because trauma also really, that's one of the things that I have found in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, is that I have learned to love myself and others. And if you're a person that has been, especially, I know a lot of the people participating have been on the receiving end of childhood abuse or narcissism, right? And so that wounds, that it makes it hard to trust others with our hearts. It makes us hard to love ourselves or feel lovable. And so I think a lot of the work that I do, even though I'm operating from the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and people might be like, yeah, but what does that have to do with trauma? Like, it has everything to do with it. An experience of falling in love with your own humanity and the humanity of others.
Yeah. Oh, so beautiful and such a big, beautiful vision. Oh, thank you, Daralyse, so much. I appreciate your expertise and you sharing yourself so vulnerably and bravely, and this beautiful free gift that you're offering our viewers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pi, and thank you to everyone who took the time to watch and listen and engage. And I hope something that I said was helpful, because we may not have met, but I deeply, deeply care about you.
Yeah. Oh, me too. That's why I do this series. So yes, thank you everybody who's watching and who's joined us today for Trusting After Trauma Season 3. We're going to continue to explore with our experts on how we can transition to transformation after narcissistic abuse and heal our body, mind, and spirit to live joyful, authentic lives. We'll see you soon.